And we are following major breaking news out of college athletics, where the Big Ten is now expanding west. USC and UCLA planning to leave the Pac-12 for the Big Ten as early as 2024. That is the latest, according to our Matt Norlander, who confirmed the news for us this afternoon. This signaling, of course, the latest seismic shift in conference realignment on the heels of Texas and Oklahoma deciding to head to the SEC. So here's a look at the new look Big Ten Conference, adding in USC and UCLA. They would now have 16 teams that would match the number of teams that the SEC will have once Texas and Oklahoma join them as well. Let's welcome in two of our experts who are in Los Angeles right now, the place to be apparently for the Elite 11 Day 3. We have Pate and Bud Elliot there. Josh, I want to start with you. I mean, did the rumor mill start to heat up when this news started to trickle down on social media? What was the vibe out there?
Well, it was one of those rare mornings where I ate breakfast, and so you're standing in the breakfast line and you get there and no one's whispering, and by the time you're checking out, everyone's whispering. And it's crazy that you're in Los Angeles, Bud, this morning, because there are a lot of people here. There are team officials, there are conference officials, there are people who have worked with the Pac-12, used to work with the Pac-12, and it just sent this immediate reverberation and ripple effect out. And the consensus reaction was, well, there goes the Pac-12. You know, the Pac-12's done. That's almost like an afterthought now. But Bud, like, immediately, I think everyone's mind shifted in a couple of directions. You're either in the media rights camp, where you're just talking about the business side of things, or you're in the conference realignment camp, where most of our minds are, and you're thinking, okay, the SEC's made their moves, and then the Big Ten just made a huge couple of counter moves. This is not checkers. That's very much a chess move on the part of the Big Ten. And then you kind of say, and what? And who gets left out? And who's included? And to me, it all comes down to, like, how many seats at that table are there. You know, the SEC's got one. Definitely the Big Ten's got one. But as for the rest of the country, in my mind, there is clearly room at the table for a third, if you want to call it, super conference. Because like you and I were talking about before we went live, FSU's going to be there somewhere. Oregon's going to be there somewhere. Oklahoma is obviously moved already. But there are still enough brands out there, I think, to create a third big seat at that table.
Josh, this is an absolute gift from the content gods, right? Will it be just two enormous conferences that maybe have 20 teams each? Is the SEC done? Maybe we'll have a third conference, which is some combination of the ACC, Pac-12, and existing Big 12 once the Oklahoma and Texas schools go to the SEC. And what about the college football playoff? They declined to expand. We thought it was done this summer. Maybe there were some things already in the works. Deals like this don't come together in just mere days. A lot of stuff to talk about here.
Yeah.
So, Josh, I mean, you're saying, look, I think there's room for a third super conference, if you will. I mean, the big thing on social media right now is you hear a lot of people say, look, the Pac-12 is done. The Big 12's got to be licking its chops here. So what is the next move in regard to these two conferences?
Well, the thing to keep in mind with the current rumor and speculation in our industry, which I don't think concerns fans a whole lot, but all of a sudden it's at the forefront, has been this Big Ten media rights deal. You know, we're wondering, is CBS in the game? Is another major conference and network in the game? But I think the big talking point out west had always been, okay, once that subsides, then the Pac-12's renegotiation window was coming up. And a lot of people on the West Coast thought, wow, we're going to be able to probably reap a big financial windfall from whoever didn't get that Big Ten deal. And all of a sudden you're asking yourself, well, what's the Pac-12 deal worth? Or is there more radical realignment coming that creates a lot more attractive ACC? The ACC's got that grant of rights deal right now, as you well know.
Until 2036. Yeah.
And so there's so much that you wake up every morning thinking is concrete, and then by the time you go to bed that night, it looks like a totally different world. But I do think that the next big talking point, especially within the business side of the college football industry, is the Big Ten media rights deal when it gets announced, and then the subsequent. Because you've got more media rights deals coming up. The Pac-12, like I said, was coming up. Where do they go, and how attractive a product is that at this point?
Bud, let me ask you this. What do you think the Big 12 does now? What's their next move?
So the Big 12 has Texas and Oklahoma for, 2 more years? They might get out of it a little bit earlier than we think. But I think if you're the Big 12, maybe you reach out to the Pac-12 and say, hey, Pac-12, you still have some nice brands, you still have some attractive media markets, and if you're able to go and do that, maybe you're able to convince Oregon with a higher share of conference revenue than they're normally getting from the Pac-12 to come and join. That would be my move. I don't think you want to keep adding smaller programs. Maybe you prey on Oregon's desperation. Maybe you take Oregon and Oregon State as a bit of a package deal. But they're in an interesting situation here. I think they have more leverage than they did before today, obviously, because previously they were by far the worst recruiting conference once you take out Oklahoma and Texas. Nobody in the new Big 12 recruits at that national title level or even really close to it. If you're able to combine some schools from the Pac-12, at least you increase your market share in a region that is now not really represented in the Big Two conferences with the exception of the LA schools.
This is clearly, reshaping the college sports landscape as we talked about it. I mean, first it was just the SEC with Oklahoma and Texas. Now USC, UCLA joining the Big Ten. Josh, with this entire reshaping that we're seeing, because it's nothing less of that, is this good for college athletics or bad?
It's the multi-billion-dollar question right now. I've already asked a couple of people that this morning. It totally hinges on how much you appreciate maybe the tradition and history-rich aspect of college athletics, or whether you look at that and say, that's romanticism. You know, that's a fairy tale book, but that's in the past. You've got to use windshield thinking instead of rear mirror thinking. If you're of that train of thought, and I kind of obviously have a foot in both camps, you can tell I'm a little conflicted. I would love for there to have been a world where everything just stays the same for about 10 years. It seems like that never happens in college athletics. But once it became pretty apparent, especially this time last year when OU and Texas left the Big 12 or announced that they were, that wasn't in the cards, then I think a lot of us, myself included, just kind of accepted what reality was. And you knew that anyone who told you, all right, OU, Texas, done, that's the end of conference realignment, that was foolish. You knew that there was one, if not two more tidal waves coming. I think we're in the middle of those two tidal waves right now. And wherever we finally rest, what I hope is that there is enough of the fabric that, you know, people like me grew up loving about the sport. I hope that there's enough of that we still look at the college football product in 2030. Once you've got your new playoff and once every conference is realigned and you say, yeah, this kind of looks like college football still. I mean, I guess I reassessed expectation and that's now the hope.
I really don't think that the number is going to be 30, right? We need some teams that are willing to sign up and take losses. So if you think about this, if you're in Arkansas and you're playing an SEC-only schedule from now on, if they were to go into a super conference model like that, what are you finishing every year? 4-8? That's really not fun. There will always be teams that are willing to bet on themselves, take a check, and take some losses. So I do think that there's a lot more moves coming here. I really don't see us ending up at just 30.
Let me ask you guys this. Obviously, you're out there at 11 right now. We are talking to you about that later today. We've been catching in with you every day. I want to talk about what this means for recruiting, and then especially when it comes to these two schools, because you saw guys at USC, obviously Lincoln Ryland, Caleb Williams going there, and it seemed a much easier path for them. And to get these guys to come over to USC, hey, look, you know, we're going to own the Pac-12. We're going to get to the playoff at some point there. Bud, for these schools, how does this impact their recruiting?
I think it only helps USC and UCLA's recruiting. Now, while it is true that they're not going to be as close to their parents, and you know they'll probably be pretty high in their Sky Miles accounts if this thing goes through, if they want to watch their kids play road games. What's the alternative? You really can't stay in LA if you want to play in a real major conference now once USC and UCLA leave the Pac-12, pending its new alignment. And they're going to get a lot more money out of this deal. The Big Ten laps the Pac-12 in terms of funding, and UCLA definitely needs that. USC has quite a bit of cash on hand already, but I think it only helps Lincoln Riley and Chip Kelly in recruiting.
Josh Pate, I want to knock that same question over to you.
Well, my big question, really, when the SEC made their move and the Big Ten, whether they had made moves or not, had a new media rights deal coming up. But my big question has been, when you look at the increased size of that media rights revenue pie, whether players were going to get any access to that. Because there are really two differing schools of thought here. One was NIL. You take your chances on that market, and if you can make something, then good for you. And then there was another train of thought, and a lot of coaches buy into this, saying, wait, we're making how many hundreds of millions of dollars? Like, Amanda, just for reference, it's estimated that each Big Ten and SEC member institution will soon be cashing $100 million per year paychecks just from media rights. And so coaches have looked at it and said, why don't we just learn to distribute revenue a little bit, where if I'm Arkansas or if I'm UCLA or if I'm Oregon State, in another world, we can at least somewhat inject some, if you want to call it artificial parity or competitive balance, call it that, but inject that into our game. Well, now I look and I wonder, with what this media rights deal is worth with the Big Ten, with what it is worth in the SEC, I still wonder if that's on the table. Because to me, one of the only plays out there to counter the, as Bud said, massive recruiting advantage you have now as being part of the Big Ten and the SEC is if someone gets creative and they enter into a new media rights deal of their own. Let's just call it a third super conference. And this is way out there thinking, I admit that. But if there is a world where a media partner and that other conference agree to do something that maybe the Big Ten and the SEC aren't willing to do, and that is enter into revenue sharing, that may be the only logical counter I could see at this point. Because if it's just apples to apples, Bud's right. There is no counter. It's just game over. It's just checkmate.
Josh, Pate, Bud Elliot, we appreciate it. I know this is not what you woke up this morning and thought you were going to be doing there at the Elite 11 finals, so we appreciate you guys hopping on with us with all of your insight into this breaking news. Again, USC, UCLA headed to the Big Ten as early as 2024. Those are our partners there at 24/7 Sports. I also want to mention Josh Pate, of course, his very popular show, Late Kick with Josh Pate, a new episode coming down this afternoon. Make sure to check it out. Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.